Hey, a park ranger once told me he heard a missing hiker's whistle 3 days after the search was called off, coming from a canyon nobody could reach on foot. 2 short, 1 long. The exact pattern the hiker used to call his daughter back when she wandered too far from camp. That code was never written in any case file. Nobody outside that family should have known it. He checked his radio log twice, then a third time, hoping he'd misheard. He hadn't. He never went back into that canyon again, and within the year he'd transferred to another district entirely. To understand why that whistle still bothers him, you have to go back to an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that starts with cold coffee and a stack of paperwork nobody wants to finish. Dale Coomer had been a ranger for 12 years by then, long enough that most things in these mountains didn't surprise him anymore. He'd pulled bodies out of creek beds after flash floods. He'd talked down drunk hunters who wandered onto private land with loaded rifles. He'd sat with families in the parking lot of the ranger station while search teams came back empty-handed. And he'd learned how to keep his face steady when there was nothing good left to say. So when his supervisor handed him the file that morning, a formality, really, just paperwork to close out a search that had been called off 2 weeks earlier, Dale didn't think twice about it. A man named Russell Tovey had gone missing in Widow Canyon back in early October. And after 11 days of grid searches, dog teams, and 2 helicopter sweeps that turned up nothing, the county had made the call everyone hated making. The search was suspended. Dale's job now was just to hike the access trail one more time, note the trail conditions, confirm the closure signage was still up, and file it all so the case could move to inactive status. Nothing dramatic. Just an old ranger doing an old kind of paperwork walk. He topped off his truck at the station before heading out, checked his radio against dispatch, and packed an extra liter of water even though the trail was barely 4 miles round trip. Old habit. He'd learned a long time ago that canyons like this one didn't care how short the trail looked on the map. The terrain folded in on itself in ways that made distances feel longer than they were, and cell service dropped out almost a mile before the trailhead, same as it always had. He noted the dead zone on his paper map, the way he always did, a small habit that had saved him more than once. Then he clipped his radio to his vest, locked the truck, and started up the trail. The morning was quiet in the way October mornings usually were up there. Cold enough to see his breath, the leaves mostly down, the light coming through the bare branches at a low slant that made the whole canyon look flatter than it actually was. He passed the trail register near the base, flipped through the last few entries out of habit. Nothing since the search had ended. No new names. That was normal. The trail had been closed to the public since Tovey went missing, and closed trails didn't get visitors. Not out here, not with a missing person's name still fresh in the local paper. About 20 minutes in, his radio gave a short burst of static, the kind that happened in these dead zones more often than dispatch liked to admit. For half a second, underneath the static, there was something that sounded almost like a name. Dale slowed, thumbed the radio, set his call sign into it. Nothing came back but more static, then silence. He didn't think much of it. Rangers who'd worked this canyon for years all had stories about the radio doing strange things on this stretch. Crosstalk from another frequency, some quirk in the rock formations that bounced signals around. He kept walking. That was the kind of detail people remember later because it seemed useless at the time. The trail narrowed as it climbed, hugging the edge of a dry creek bed that fed into the canyon proper. Dale noted storm damage along the way, a downed limb here, some erosion near a switchback there, jotting quick notes in the small notebook he kept in his vest pocket. This was the part of the job nobody saw on the news. Not the dramatic rescues. Just a man walking alone through the woods, writing down which parts of a trail needed fixing before spring. He was maybe 2 miles in, close to the point where the trail dropped into the canyon floor, when he heard it the first time. A whistle. 2 short bursts, then one long one, carrying down from somewhere above him on the ridge. Dale stopped walking. He knew that pattern. He'd read it in Tovey's file 3 separate times while prepping for the search, a detail the man's ex-wife had mentioned almost as an afterthought during the initial interview. Russell used to whistle that exact sequence to call his daughter back to camp whenever she wandered off exploring. 2 short, 1 long. It was a family thing, the kind of small private code that never gets written down anywhere official because nobody thinks it matters until it's the only detail that does. Except it had been written down. It was in the file. Dale was almost sure of that. He stood still on the trail for a long moment, listening. Nothing followed. Just wind moving through bare branches, and somewhere far off, a single crow calling out and then going quiet. He told himself it was a hunter. People whistled for their dogs out here all the time, even on closed trails, even when they weren't supposed to be there. He told himself the pattern was probably a coincidence. 2 short and 1 long wasn't exactly a rare way to whistle. He kept walking, a little faster now, telling himself the same practical things a person tells themselves when they don't want to feel what they're already starting to feel. But when he stopped at the next switchback to catch his breath, he pulled out his notebook and flipped back through the file summary he'd copied down before the search began. He read through Tovey's personal details twice. Slow, careful, the way he read things when he needed to be sure. The whistle code wasn't there. He'd remembered it from the search briefing, from something the ex-wife had said out loud in a shaking voice while the search coordinator nodded along and wrote something else down entirely. It had never made it into the official file. Dale was certain of that now. He checked his notes a second time, just to be sure his memory wasn't playing tricks after 2 weeks. It wasn't. There was no whistle code anywhere in the paperwork he was carrying, and no way anyone out here today, hiker, hunter, or otherwise, could have known to whistle it back to him exactly right, twice, from a stretch of closed trail that hadn't seen a single logged visitor in 2 weeks. He stood there a while longer, notebook open in his hand, the canyon wind picking up just enough to rattle the dry leaves around his boots. Somewhere above him, the ridge stayed quiet now, like it was waiting to see what he'd do next. Dale didn't whistle back. That was the first real decision he made that day, and he'd think about it a lot over the following months, whether it had been the right one, whether it had mattered at all. He keyed his radio instead, gave dispatch his position, and asked flat out if there were any other units, volunteers, or hunters cleared to be on this trail. Dispatch came back a minute later, the signal thin but readable. Negative. No other personnel in that grid. No permits issued for the closed section. As far as the county was concerned, Dale was the only person for 2 miles in any direction. He stood there with the radio still in his hand, looking up toward the ridge where the sound had come from. The canyon walls folded away above him, rock and thin pine, steep enough in places that even experienced climbers avoided it without gear. He knew this terrain. He'd hiked search grids through here for 11 straight days back in October. There was no trail up that direction, no reasonable route a person could take on foot to reach that ridge and whistle down at him. If someone was up there, they hadn't walked there. Not easily, not without technical climbing gear nobody had any reason to be carrying on a closed county trail. He kept moving, telling himself the smart thing to do was finish the assessment and get back to the truck before dark. That was true. It was also, if he was honest with himself later, the first time that day fear had started doing some of his thinking for him. The whistle came again about 10 minutes later, same pattern. Closer this time, or it felt closer. echoing down off the canyon wall in a way that made it hard to pin down exactly where it originated. Dale had spent enough time in canyons like this to know that sound did strange things against rock. Bounced, doubled back, made a source 30 feet away sound like it was coming from 3 different directions at once. He tried to tell himself that was all this was. Acoustics, a trick of the terrain. Then he did something he wouldn't be able to fully explain afterward. Not to his supervisor, not to his wife, not really even to himself. He exhaled hard, sharp, almost like the start of a whistle he never let himself finish. More reflex than intention. The kind of breath a person lets out when they're trying to steady their nerves. The whistle came back immediately. Same 2 short bursts, same long note, timed to his breath like it had been listening for it. Dale stood very still. He'd trained rookies for years on wildlife behavior, on how animals respond to human sound, how certain birds mimic calls, how coyotes yip in patterns that spook new hikers half to death every single season. None of that explained this. Animals didn't wait for a person to exhale before answering. They didn't match rhythm that precisely, not from that distance, not through solid rock. An old memory surfaced, something from his very first season on the job, a piece of advice from a ranger who'd retired the year after Dale got hired. They'd been sitting on the tailgate of a truck at the end of a long shift, and the old man had said it almost offhand, the way people say things they don't expect anyone to remember. If something out here ever whistles back exact, you stop whistling. You don't answer it again. Dale had laughed it off at the time, chalked it up to old-timer superstition, the kind of thing every long-serving ranger seemed to pick up eventually. He wasn't laughing now. He didn't whistle again. He didn't breathe sharp again either, not on purpose. He turned back toward the trail and started walking, faster than the terrain really allowed, catching his boot twice on loose shale and forcing himself to slow down before he turned an ankle 2 miles from his truck with no other units in the grid. That was when the fog started coming down. It moved fast, the way it sometimes did in these narrow canyons when the temperature dropped quick in the afternoon, rolling off the ridge in a gray sheet that swallowed the tops of the pines first and then crept lower, thinning the light until the trail ahead of him looked like it was dissolving at the edges. His radio, when he checked it again, gave him nothing but static, no matter how many times he keyed the mic. He glanced at his watch. Still hours until sunset, technically. It didn't feel that way anymore. The fog ate the daylight faster than any clock could account for. He didn't hear the whistle again. That should have made him feel better. It didn't. The absence of it felt worse somehow, like something had stopped calling because it didn't need to anymore, because it already knew exactly where he was headed. He made it back to the trailhead a little before 4, moving at a pace that left his lungs burning by the time the parking area came into view through the thinning fog. His truck was right where he'd left it, alone in the gravel turnout, exactly as it should have been. He almost let himself relax at the sight of it. Then he saw the print near the front tire, a single bare footprint, pressed into the soft dirt at the edge of the gravel, facing back toward the trail he'd just come down. No shoe tread, no sock line, just the clear, deliberate shape of a bare foot. Toes pointed toward the canyon like whoever left it had been standing there recently, watching the trailhead, waiting to see if Dale would come back out. There was only one print. No trail leading to it. No trail leading away from it. Just that single mark in the dirt, close enough to his truck that he must have walked within a few feet of it without noticing. And Dale was certain as a person can be about something that doesn't make sense, that he had never once taken his eyes off that trailhead the entire final stretch down. He didn't touch it. He didn't photograph it either, which he'd regret later, though at the time all he wanted was to get in the truck and get the engine running. He sat there for a long moment with the doors locked, hands on the wheel, watching the fog crawl across the empty lot in the mirror before he finally pulled out. Dale filed his trail assessment the next morning like nothing had happened. He didn't mention the whistle in his report. He didn't mention the print. Some part of him understood even then that writing it down would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for, and some other part of him understood that no one would believe it anyway, not without proof he didn't have. The Tovey case stayed open on a shelf somewhere in the county archive, technically inactive, never officially closed. Dale requested a transfer to a different district before the following spring, citing personal reasons he never fully explained to anyone who asked. He still works for the Park Service today, just not anywhere near Widow Canyon, and by most accounts he's never whistled for anything again. Not a dog, not a hiking partner, not even out of habit, not once, not anywhere, not since. The next account comes from a ranger working a different section of the same forest system, a woman named Priya Rana, whose story starts with something far less dramatic than a whistle in an empty canyon. It starts with a backpack, sitting upright and untouched, on a trail that had been closed for 3 weeks. Priya found the backpack on a Thursday morning, the kind of gray, damp Thursday that made every fallen tree look the same as the last one. She'd been assigned to the closed section for 3 days straight, working her way through the storm damage assessment after a system had rolled through and dropped 2 feet of rain in 18 hours, enough to wash out half a mile of trail and take down more timber than the district had seen in a decade. It was tedious work. Chainsaw checks, hazard tape, radioing mileage markers back to dispatch so the maintenance crew would know where to start once the trail reopened. Not the kind of job that left much room for anything but the task in front of you. She'd started the morning like she started every morning that week, checking her gear at the truck, filling her thermos with gas station coffee that had gone lukewarm by the second cup, radioing dispatch her starting mile marker before she headed in. The trailhead gate was locked behind her, same as always. The orange closure signage zip-tied to the chain exactly where the maintenance crew had left it. Except, it wasn't exactly where they'd left it. She noticed that almost right away, the sign had shifted, moved about 6 feet down the fence line from where she remembered it being tied the day before. She stood there a second, studying it, then shrugged it off. Storm wind. The whole district had been getting hammered with gusts strong enough to snap limbs the size of her arm. A shifted zip tie wasn't exactly a mystery worth radioing in. She kept working her way up the trail, marking hazard trees with pink tape, noting washouts in her log. The chainsaw sound cutting through the wet quiet every time she cleared a downed limb blocking the path. Around mile marker 2, the trail curved through a stand of hemlock that had mostly survived the storm untouched, and that was where the silence hit her. It wasn't dramatic. It was just an absence. The chainsaw echo that usually rolled off the canyon walls after every cut simply wasn't rolling back the way it should have. She stood still for a second afterward, listening, telling herself the terrain out here did that sometimes, swallowed sound in strange pockets depending on how the wind was moving through the hollow. She'd heard other rangers mention it before. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't much of anything either. That was when she saw the backpack. It was sitting dead center on the trail, upright, resting against nothing, like someone had set it down gently and walked away without a second thought. Blue, mid-sized, the kind day hikers carried. Priya stopped a good 10 feet back and just looked at it for a while before she moved any closer. There was no reason for it to be there. The trail had been closed for 3 weeks. She'd checked the register herself before this assignment started. No permits issued, no names logged, not one visitor recorded since the closure went up. and the way it was sitting bothered her more than she wanted to admit. No drag marks in the mud around it. No disturbance in the leaf litter. It was zipped, clean, dry, despite the storm that had soaked everything else in the district for the better part of 2 days. Whoever left it hadn't dropped it running. They'd set it down. She called it in to dispatch, gave her position, described the pack. Dispatch pulled the district's missing persons list while she waited. Boots planted in the mud, chainsaw idle at her side. Nothing matched. No reports filed for anyone in this section. Not that week, not that month. She crouched down and unzipped it, gloves on, moving slow the way she'd been trained to when something didn't add up. Inside was mostly what you'd expect: a half-empty water bottle, a granola bar wrapper, a thin rain jacket folded neater than most adults folded their laundry, and tucked into the front pocket, a single sheet of paper, folded twice, soft at the creases like it had been handled a lot. She unfolded it carefully. A child's drawing. Crayon, the kind of loose, uneven lines little kids make before they've learned to color inside anything. It showed a trail, brown and winding, trees on either side done in quick green scribbles. And standing beside one of the trees was a figure, tall, thin, drawn taller than the trees around it, with no face filled in, just a blank oval where a face should have gone. Priya sat back on her heels for a second, looking at it. Kids drew strange things all the time. That was the rational voice in her head talking, the one she trusted, the one that had gotten her through 8 years of this job without losing her nerve over things that turned out to be nothing. A tall figure with no face wasn't evidence of anything. It was a kid's drawing, probably left behind by accident, probably nothing at all. But there was no kid on the missing persons list. No family reported, no permit. Just a backpack, sitting alone and untouched in the exact center of a trail that had been closed to the public for 3 full weeks, with nobody around for miles, and a drawing tucked inside it that felt heavier in her hands than a single sheet of paper had any right to feel. That should have been enough to make her radio it in as evidence and move on with her assessment. It was. She bagged the pack, logged the location precisely, and kept working her way up the trail the rest of the day like nothing had thrown her off. But that night, back at the ranger station filling out her incident report, she found herself pulling up the district's old case files without really deciding to. Just curiosity, she told herself. Just wanting to see if anything similar had ever happened on that stretch before. That was the first thing that didn't fit. It wouldn't be the last. The station was quiet by the time Priya started digging through the old files, most of the other rangers already gone for the evening. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling against the cold, coming in outside. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for at first. She just typed the trail name into the district's record search and started scrolling. 2 entries came back, both years apart, both involving an unclaimed backpack recovered from the same closed section of trail, both logged by different rangers who no longer worked the district. The details lined up close enough to bother her. Items inside undisturbed, no missing persons match, no explanation ever recorded in the final case notes beyond a single line. Item recovered, no further action taken. Nobody had connected the 3 incidents before. There was no reason anyone would have. They were years apart, filed by different people, buried in a record system that mostly existed to satisfy insurance requirements, not to notice patterns. She sat there a long time with the old case files open on the screen, the cursor blinking over a field she didn't know how to fill in. Then she went back out to the evidence room where she'd logged the backpack that afternoon and pulled the trail register, the physical logbook kept at the station, separate from the digital one. The kind most hikers never bothered signing anymore now that permits were mostly tracked electronically. There was a new entry. It hadn't been there that morning. She was sure of that, because she'd flipped through the register herself before heading out, checking for any names she might have missed. Now, there was a line added near the bottom of the current page, in handwriting that leaned hard to one side, loose and uneven in a way that made her stomach turn the second she recognized it. It matched the crayon drawing. Not the words. There were no words that made sense on their own. Just a scrawled trail name and a date 3 weeks in the future. But the slant, the pressure, the childlike unevenness of the letters. Whoever had signed the register had signed it the same way a small hand held a crayon too hard against paper. Nobody had come into the station that evening. She would have heard the door. She locked the register in the evidence room next to the backpack and told herself she'd sort it out in the morning. That stress and a long week were probably doing more work on her nerves than anything on that trail actually was. It didn't help much. She barely slept. And when she came back in the next day, the first thing she did before her shift even officially started was track down Earl Whitmore, a retired trail volunteer who'd worked that section of the district for close to 30 years before his knees gave out on him. She found him at the little maintenance shed near the trailhead gate, doing what he always did most mornings out of habit more than obligation, sharpening tools nobody had asked him to sharpen. She asked him straight out if he knew anything about backpacks turning up on that closed stretch. He didn't answer right away. He set down the file he was working with, looked at her for a second like he was deciding something, then looked back at the gate instead of at her. "That section takes things sometimes," he said, voice low, like he didn't want the words to carry any further than they needed to. "And it gives them back neat." His hands went still on the tool in his lap. "Don't go asking why. You won't get an answer you can use, and you'll spend the rest of your career trying anyway." He wouldn't say much more than that, no matter how she pushed. He'd worked that trail longer than she'd been alive, he told her, and there were things about it he'd learned to leave alone. The same way a person learns not to poke a hornet's nest just because they're curious what's inside. Priya went back to work that day like the job required, but the trail felt different under her boots now, even in daylight, even with the sun cutting clean through the canopy for the first time in a week. She noticed things she might have dismissed before. The closure tape at the gate, retied that morning, not by her, not by anyone on the maintenance crew, tighter than regulation required, in a knot she didn't recognize from any training manual. The trail cameras posted along that stretch, meant to catch trespassers during the closure, kept her returning corrupted files whenever she pulled the footage. Not blank, not black screen, just static scrambled fragments where clear video should have been. Every single time, only on that section of trail. Her radio worked fine most places in the district. On that stretch, it only reached dispatch clean from one specific pull-off near the second switchback. A dead zone everywhere else that hadn't shown up on any prior equipment survey. She reopened the trail 2 days later, once the maintenance crew cleared the last of the storm debris, filing the report the way procedure required. Backpack logged as unclaimed evidence, incident noted, case left open pending further information that she already suspected would never come. She never mentioned the register entry to her supervisor. She wasn't sure how she would have explained it without sounding like she needed time off. What she did do, quietly, without telling anyone, was pull the old missing persons archive going back further than the district's digital records, into the boxes of paper files kept in a back room nobody had reorganized in years. It took her most of an afternoon. When she finally found what she was looking for, a case from decades earlier, a child reported lost near that same stretch of trail, search called off after 11 days with no resolution. She almost didn't open the folder. Almost. Inside, clipped to the original incident report was a hand-drawn sketch a search volunteer had made at the time, copying something the child's older sibling had drawn while waiting at the command post. A trail. Trees in quick strokes. A tall, thin figure with no face standing beside one of them. It matched the drawing from the backpack stroke for stroke, decades apart, down to the exact curve where the figure's shoulder met its blank, faceless head. Priya closed the folder and sat there a long while in the quiet back room, the old paper smell thick in the air, before she put it back exactly where she'd found it. She still works that district today. She still walks that stretch of trail when the job requires it, but she's never gone up there alone again, not once. Not even on the easy days, not even when it would have saved her 20 minutes to do so. The next account moves off the trail entirely, into the ranger station itself, on a graveyard shift where a young dispatcher answered a routine radio check-in from a call sign that had been retired for 11 years. Wanda Suttle had been working the overnight dispatch desk for exactly 6 weeks when the call came in. Still new enough to the job that she double-checked most procedures against the laminated reference sheet taped beside her monitor. The graveyard shift wasn't glamorous. Mostly, it was quiet stretches, broken up by routine check-ins from the handful of units still out after dark, the occasional weather advisory to log, and long silences filled by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and whatever bad coffee she'd managed to brew in the break room's ancient machine. That night had been slower than usual. A cold front had pushed through earlier in the evening, clearing the sky but dropping temperatures hard enough that most of the seasonal crews had already checked in for the night. Wanda spent the first few hours sorting through old logbooks that needed digitizing, a task nobody else wanted, glancing up now and then at the grainy black and white feed from the fire tower camera mounted on the far ridge. Nothing moved on it. Nothing ever did this time of year. The check-in call came in a little after 2 in the morning. It followed proper radio procedure to the letter. Call sign, position, status, the kind of clean, practiced cadence that only came from someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Wanda logged it automatically, the way she'd been trained, before something about the call sign snagged in her memory. She pulled up the active roster to confirm, scrolling through units currently assigned to overnight coverage. The call sign wasn't there. She checked the archived roster next, thinking maybe it was an old unit still floating around on someone's outdated radio. It was archived, all right. Decommissioned 11 years earlier, according to the personnel notes attached, the unit retired along with the ranger who'd carried it. A name Wanda didn't recognize. No reassignment listed, no further record beyond a single closing line that simply read, "Unit retired, no successor assigned." She sat there staring at the screen for a moment, telling herself it was probably some other station's crosstalk bleeding onto their frequency, an old radio finally rediscovered in someone's garage, a prank from one of the seasonal guys who liked messing with the new dispatcher. That happened sometimes. She'd heard stories from the other overnight staff about equipment doing strange things out here. Interference bouncing off the ridgelines in ways nobody had ever fully explained. Then the voice came back through, still following procedure exactly, reading off a set of GPS coordinates for a routine position update. Wanda logged them out of habit before she really registered what she was looking at. The coordinates corresponded to a fire tower on the western ridge. A fire tower that had burned to the foundation more than a decade ago, long since removed from active service. Nothing left of it now but a scorched clearing nobody bothered hiking to anymore. She sat with her pen hovering over the log for a long moment before she wrote it down anyway, because that was the job, because dispatch didn't get to decide what was real and what wasn't. Dispatch just recorded what came through the radio and let someone else sort out the details later. Her hand wasn't quite steady when she did it. She noticed that and didn't like noticing it. The rest of the shift passed slow and uneasy, the fluorescent hum overhead suddenly louder than it had been an hour before, the coffee gone cold and forgotten in its mug. She didn't mention the call to anyone right away. It felt easier, somehow, to treat it like a strange but explainable glitch. The kind of story she'd tell the next shift as a passing oddity rather than something that actually mattered. She brought it up the next evening anyway, mostly out of a nagging feeling she couldn't shake, catching her supervisor Gary Holt just before he clocked out. Gary had been with the district almost 30 years, close enough to retirement himself that most of the younger staff treated him like a walking archive of everything that had ever gone wrong or gone strange in these mountains. She described the call, the coordinates, the timing. She watched something shift in his face while she talked, subtle but unmistakable, the look of a man hearing something he'd hoped never to hear again. He didn't say much at first. He glanced toward the door like he wanted to make sure it was closed, then told her, low and even, to log it and not repeat it to the burn crew scheduled out there the next morning. Just log it, he said. Don't bring it up around the guys. It doesn't help anything, and it scares people who don't need to be scared before a burn. Wanda pressed him a little, asked if this had happened before, if he knew anything about the retired call sign or the ranger who'd carried it. Gary was quiet for a while, weighing something. Finally, he told her the ranger had never been officially declared missing. He'd simply stopped showing up one season, and the paperwork had processed him as reassigned. No forwarding station listed. No further contact ever logged. Nobody talked about it much anymore. It had happened before Gary's time even started, passed down more as station folklore than official history. If that sign checks in again, he told her, voice dropping lower, you say 10-4 and nothing else. You don't ask questions, you don't engage. You log it, you say 10-4, and you let it go. The burn crew went out the next morning as scheduled. Working the section of forest Wanda had logged coordinates for the night before, clearing brush and controlling the fire line the way they always did before a scheduled burn. Around midday, word came back through the radio that the crew had found something unexpected while cutting a fire break. A stone foundation buried under decades of undergrowth. Exactly where the old fire tower coordinates placed it. No record of it existing anywhere in the district's current mapping, as though the tower's footprint had simply been erased from every file, except the one carried by a call sign that shouldn't have still been transmitting. Wanda requested a transfer off the graveyard shift within the week. It didn't come through in time. The check-in call came again the following Tuesday. Same time, same procedure, same steady voice that never once wavered from protocol, no matter how many years had supposedly passed since anyone last used that frequency. Wanda logged it, said 10-4 exactly as instructed, and sat alone at the desk afterward, listening to the fluorescent hum fill the silence where the static should have picked back up and hadn't. The transfer request Wanda filed sat unprocessed for nearly 2 weeks, caught up in the same understaffing problem that plagued most rural districts this time of year. And in the meantime, the overnight desk became hers by default. Nobody else willing or available to cover it. She started bringing a second thermos to work. She started leaving the break room light on even when she wasn't in there, just so the hallway outside the dispatch office never went fully dark. The check-in calls kept their schedule, once a week, always around 2 in the morning, always following the same clipped procedural cadence. Wanda answered exactly the way Gary had told her to. 10-4, nothing else. She stopped writing the coordinates down word for word after the second call, just logged that contact had been made, kept the details vague in a way that felt like protecting herself from something she couldn't name. She pulled the archived personnel file on the old call sign anyway, during a slow stretch one night when curiosity got the better of caution. The ranger's name was Everett Hollis. Hired young, worked the district for 9 years, mostly assigned to fire tower relief and remote patrol. The file was thin, mostly routine performance notes, nothing unusual until the final entry, dated the same week the tower burned. Unit retired. Reassigned, no forwarding station. No further contact. There was no incident report attached to the fire. No cause of the blaze listed. No mention of Hollis being present when it happened, or absent, or anywhere at all. It was as if the district had simply closed the book on him the same week it closed the book on the tower, filing both away under the same bureaucratic silence. Wanda thought about asking Gary more directly, pushing past the vague warnings he'd given her that first night. She decided against it. Something in the careful way he'd avoided her eyes made her think he genuinely didn't know more than he'd already told her, and that not knowing was its own kind of warning. 3 weeks into the pattern, the call came in different. It was still 2 in the morning. It still opened with the correct call sign. But this time, after Wanda gave her 10-4, the voice didn't sign off the way it always had. It paused, just long enough that she almost keyed her mic to repeat herself. And then it asked, flat and conversational, whether she'd gotten settled into the new desk all right. Wanda's hand froze over the radio. She hadn't mentioned anything about being new. Standard check-in procedure didn't include personal conversation, not from any unit, retired or active. She sat very still for a moment, telling herself it could have been picked up somewhere. Some casual mention from another dispatcher that had made it back through station gossip. It didn't feel like that explanation fit. It felt, sitting there in the buzzing fluorescent light with her coffee going cold beside her, like the voice already knew things about her it had no ordinary way of knowing. She didn't answer the question. She said 10-4 again, flatter this time, and the line went quiet the way it always did afterward. The following week, the voice read back a phone number during the check-in, folded casually into the middle of the routine position report the way a person might mention an old fact in passing. It took Wanda a moment to place it. It was her own number, the one on her personal cell phone, unlisted, given only to her landlord and her 2 closest friends since she'd moved to the district that spring. She sat in the dispatch chair a long time after that call ended, radio silent in front of her, the hallway light outside still burning the way she always left it now. She didn't sleep well the next several nights, not that it mattered much on a graveyard schedule, but the exhaustion started showing in ways her coworkers noticed. The shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched a little whenever the radio crackled to life. Even during ordinary daytime hours she wasn't scheduled for. The nightly check-ins kept coming, but their timing started shifting in a way that unsettled her more than the content ever had. They no longer arrived strictly at 2 in the morning, the hour that had presumably matched Hollis's original patrol schedule from over a decade earlier. Instead, they began arriving whenever Wanda herself sat down at the desk, regardless of the hour, as if the schedule had quietly reoriented itself around her, instead of the old routine it had followed for years before she ever took the job. She stopped answering entirely after that. Gary had told her 10-4 and nothing else, but Wanda decided even that was more engagement than she wanted to offer. When the tone came through now, she simply sat in silence and let it play out, pen resting untouched beside the logbook, waiting for the static to fade back into ordinary quiet the way it always eventually did. That should have made the call stop. It didn't. The silence became its own kind of ritual. Wanda would hear the check-in tone start, that familiar 3-note pattern the old radios used to signal an incoming transmission, and instead of reaching for the mic, She'd fold her hands in her lap and wait, watching the little red light on the console blink steady until it eventually stopped. It always stopped eventually. Some nights it took 30 seconds. Some nights it dragged on for what felt like several minutes, the light blinking, patient and unhurried, as if it understood she wasn't going to answer and had all the time in the world regardless. She kept the job. She wasn't sure why exactly when she thought about it honestly. Part of her told herself it was just money, just the practical difficulty of finding another position in a county this small, this rural, where dispatch jobs didn't open up often and she couldn't afford to be picky. But some other part of her, quieter and harder to admit to, wondered if leaving would have made any difference at all. Whatever this was, it seemed to know things about her that had nothing to do with her employment. It seemed less interested in the job than in her. 3 weeks after she stopped answering, on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday night with rain ticking steady against the station windows, the tone came early. Not 2 in the morning. Just past midnight, catching her mid-sip on her coffee, the sound cutting through the quiet with none of the usual build-up. She set the mug down carefully, the way a person moves when they don't want to make any sound of their own, and watched the console light begin its steady blink. It didn't stop after 30 seconds. It didn't stop after a minute. Wanda sat with her hands flat on the desk, counting without meaning to, the way people count when they're trying to keep some part of their mind occupied with something other than fear. She got to 11 before the light finally cut out. 11 seconds. She realized only after the fact, staring at the dark console, that it was almost exactly the length of time it would take to say a full name out loud, slow and deliberate. First and last. The static didn't return afterward the way it usually did. That low, familiar hiss that always settled back in once a transmission ended, letting her know the frequency was still open and functioning normally. This time, there was nothing. True dead air, the kind of silence that felt heavier than ordinary quiet, like the radio itself had stopped listening rather than simply stopped speaking. She didn't touch the console for a long time. When she finally checked it, running a basic diagnostic the way she'd been trained, everything read as functioning normally. No fault codes, no connection errors. As far as the equipment was concerned, nothing unusual had happened at all. The check-in call never came again after that night. Not the following week, not the week after. Not once in all the months Wanda continued working that desk before she finally transferred to day shift the following spring. She never fully explained to her replacement why she preferred not to work overnights anymore. She simply said the graveyard shift didn't agree with her, which was true enough as far as it went. Weeks later, doing routine maintenance on the station's physical archive, another dispatcher came across the old logbook page where Wanda had recorded that first strange coordinate reading, the one matching the burned-out fire tower. Part of the page had water damage, a pale, spreading stain that had warped the paper and blurred some of the ink beneath it. The station roof had never leaked, not in that section, not in the 12 years the building had stood. Nobody could account for how moisture had gotten to that specific page and no other. The stain, when the other dispatcher held it up to the light out of idle curiosity, had a shape to it that was hard to unsee once you noticed it. Not a perfect shape. Nothing you could point to and call definitive proof of anything, but close enough to the outline of a hand pressed flat against the paper that nobody in the station ever mentioned it out loud, and the page eventually got filed away in a box nobody opened again. Wanda still works for the district, still answers radio calls most days, though always now in daylight, always with other people moving through the station around her. She still keeps a second thermos on her desk. She still leaves the hallway light on, even on shifts when she isn't the last one to lock up. The next account moves off the radio entirely, back onto a mountain road most people only drove once, and never wanted to drive again, following a seasonal gate ranger whose first season on the job nearly became his last. Marcus Whitfield had wanted this job since he was 19 years old, growing up in a county where half the men he knew had worked for the Forest Service at some point, seasonal or otherwise, and the other half wished they had. His first season started in September, right as the leaves began to turn, and most of his duties were about as unglamorous as work got: checking trail conditions, restocking supply caches, and every evening before dark, driving the old logging road up to the boundary gate to lock it for the night. The gate sat at the end of a narrow access road that wound up through second-growth timber, a relic from decades of coal and lumber operations that had long since shut down, leaving behind a network of dirt roads the Forest Service maintained more out of necessity than active use. Hunters used the lower stretch during season. Beyond the gate, the land belonged to a private timber company that didn't want trespassers wandering their property after dark, and it was Marcus's job every evening around dusk to make sure that boundaries stayed locked. It wasn't a hard job. It just required doing the same drive every night, checking the same chain, testing the same padlock, radioing his position to the station before heading back down. The road had 3 sharp bends along its climb, each one tight enough that the district had posted reduced speed signage decades ago, faded now to the point of being barely legible. The first time Marcus saw the man, it was late September, the light already thinning fast the way it did that time of year. He came around the first bend doing maybe 15 miles an hour, headlights cutting through the deepening shadow between the trees, and there he was, a man standing at the road's edge, still, no vehicle anywhere nearby, which struck Marcus as odd given how far this stretch sat from any parking area or trailhead. He slowed instinctively, the way anyone would, half expecting the man to wave him down or step back to let him pass. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching the truck approach, his posture straight and unbothered in a way that felt wrong even before Marcus could articulate why. Marcus gave him a small nod through the windshield as he passed, the kind of acknowledgement you gave strangers on back roads out of habit more than warmth, and kept driving, telling himself it was probably a hunter who'd wandered off a side trail, maybe looking for a ride back down before dark. It wasn't until the second bend, nearly 3 miles farther up the mountain, that his stomach dropped. The same man was standing there too. Same stance, same stillness, same posture with his arms hanging loose at his sides. Same clothes as far as Marcus could tell in the fading light. Plain, dark, nothing distinctive enough to swear to later, but enough of a match that the coincidence felt impossible the moment he registered it. 3 miles of winding mountain road in the time it had taken Marcus to drive it. No trail cut through that stretch of timber. No shortcut existed that would let a person on foot cover that ground faster than a truck on the actual road. Marcus didn't slow down this time. He told himself, driving a little faster than he probably should have on a grade that steep, that it had to be a different person. Similar clothes. A trick of the fading light making one stranger look like another. People saw what they expected to see sometimes, especially alone, especially getting dark, especially on a road this quiet. The gate came into view at the top of the third bend a few minutes later, and Marcus's hands were tighter on the wheel than he wanted to admit by the time he pulled up to it. He checked his mirror out of habit as he slowed to a stop. The road behind him, what little he could see of it curling back down the mountain, was empty. He got out to work the padlock, the evening cold enough now that his breath fogged in front of him, the chain rattling loud against the quiet as he unhooked it from the post. His radio crackled once with dispatch's routine end-of-shift check, and he answered it fast, glad for the sound of another human voice even through the static. He didn't see anyone else that evening. He drove back down a little too fast, headlights bouncing hard over the ruts near the bottom stretch, and told himself the whole way home that it had been nothing. A hunter, a trick of the light. Two different men who happened to be dressed alike on a mountain road at dusk. He almost believed it by the time he pulled into the station lot. Almost. The next evening, Marcus made the drive again, same time, same routine, telling himself the whole way up that yesterday had just been his mind playing tricks after a long first week on the job. New Rangers spooked easy. Everyone at the station had told him that during training, half joking, half not, the kind of thing veterans said to rookies without really explaining what they meant by it. He'd mentioned it that morning to Hal Denby, the ranger who'd trained him during his first 2 weeks and was set to retire at the end of the season. Marcus brought it up carefully, framing it like a joke, asking if anyone ever ran into hikers or hunters loitering near the gate road after dark. Hal had been quiet for a second, hands still on the coffee mug he was holding, and then said, almost offhand, that Marcus shouldn't stop on that third bend after dark, whatever was standing there. He'd said it with a small smile afterward, the kind that made it easy to write off as a hazing joke, the sort of thing old-timers said to new guys to see if they'd flinch. Marcus had laughed along with him at the time. He wasn't laughing about it now, driving up that same road with the light already going gray around the edges of the timber. He made it past the first bend without incident. No one standing there. He let himself relax slightly, gripping the wheel a little looser, telling himself that was proof enough it had been nothing the night before. The second bend was empty too. By the time he reached the long straightaway before the final climb to the gate, Marcus had almost talked himself all the way back into feeling normal. Almost. That was when his radio dropped out completely, the static cutting to flat silence in a way it hadn't done on this stretch before, not once in his first 3 weeks on the job. He glanced at it, tapped the volume, got nothing. The road here didn't have a shoulder wide enough to safely turn around, not on a grade this steep, not with the light fading the way it was. His only real option was to keep driving forward to the gate, finish the job, and head back down the way he'd come. The man was standing at the third bend, barefoot this time, in a cold that had already dropped hard enough that frost was starting to form along the road's shaded edges. He was standing exactly where Marcus needed to stop the truck to work the padlock, close enough to the gate post that there was no way to avoid him if Marcus wanted to finish the job. Marcus slowed the truck to a crawl, heart hammering hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, telling himself over and over that this was just a person, an ordinary person who needed help, maybe lost, maybe hurt, and that the responsible thing to do was stop and check on him rather than drive past and leave someone stranded on a mountain in freezing temperatures after dark. He stopped the truck about 30 feet back. The man didn't move, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge the headlights washing over him, didn't shift his weight the way a person standing in the cold naturally would, rocking slightly, stamping their feet, doing any of the small unconscious things bodies do to stay warm. He just stood there, facing the gate, as still as the trees around him. Marcus sat in the truck a long moment, hands tight on the wheel, telling himself this was ridiculous, that he had a job to do and a padlock to close and a story he'd be embarrassed to tell anyone at the station if he drove back down without finishing his route over nothing but nerves. He got out. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than it had felt just moments earlier inside the cab. He walked toward the gate with his eyes fixed carefully on the chain, the padlock, the task in front of him, deliberately not looking at the man standing now barely 20 feet off to his left. He could feel him there anyway, the way you feel someone watching you even without looking. A pressure at the edge of his vision he couldn't quite ignore, no matter how hard he tried. His hands were shaking as he worked the padlock, fumbling the key twice before it finally clicked into place. He looped the chain, checked it once, and turned back toward the truck without ever once letting his eyes drift toward the man's direction. He climbed in, locked the doors, a habit he'd never bothered with before that night, and pulled away from the gate without looking in the rearview mirror, not once, the entire drive back down the mountain. He didn't check the mirror at any of the 3 bends either. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead on the road, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark, radio still dead in his hand, until he finally hit the bottom stretch where his signal crackled back to life, and dispatch's voice came through clear and ordinary, asking for his end-of-shift confirmation like nothing in the world had happened. He gave it. His voice came out steadier than he expected. The next morning, driving back up in full daylight to do his regular gate check, Marcus made himself stop at the 3rd bend, forcing himself to look, needing to know one way or another whether what he'd seen the night before had left any trace behind. The frost along the road's edge had thickened overnight, a clean white layer coating the gravel and brush on either side of the gate. There were footprints in it, barefoot, clear enough to make out the individual toe marks, leading up toward the exact spot where the man had been standing. They didn't lead away. They simply stopped, mid-stride, as if whoever made them had taken one step too many and then ceased to exist entirely, the frost undisturbed everywhere beyond that final print. Marcus checked with dispatch later that week, asking as casually as he could manage whether any hikers or hunters had been reported missing or lost in that section during the season. The answer came back negative. No reports filed, no names on any list. As far as the district's records were concerned, nobody had been anywhere near that gate road all autumn except Marcus himself. He finished out his season, working through October and into November the way he'd planned, though he started timing his gate runs earlier every week, giving himself more daylight buffer than the job strictly required. He never mentioned the frost prints to Hal before the old ranger's retirement came through, and he never asked what exactly Hal had meant by his warning either. Some part of him understood he probably wouldn't get an answer worth having. He still works seasonal gate duty most years, though he requested a different route the following season, one that didn't pass anywhere near that 3rd bend. He still doesn't check his rearview mirror on unfamiliar mountain roads after dark. Not out of superstition exactly, he'd tell you, just habit. Just something that feels safer not to test. The next account moves away from roads and gates entirely, into a search grid on a ridge where a rescue team went looking for a missing child, and found something that didn't behave like anything they'd trained for. Ellen Voss had led search and rescue operations for the district for 6 years by the time the call came in about the missing child, long enough that she developed a kind of practiced calm most people mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was just what the job required. Panic didn't find lost hikers. Procedure did. Grid searches, radio discipline, methodical sweeps that covered ground the way a comb covered hair, slow and thorough, leaving nothing untouched. The child was 6 years old, a boy named Tyler, who'd wandered off from a family campsite near the lower trailhead sometime in the early afternoon. Gone long enough by the time anyone noticed that the family's frantic search had already covered the immediate area twice before Ellen's team arrived to take over properly. It was the kind of case that got everyone moving fast. 6 years old. Temperatures dropping after dark. A search area that included steep wooded terrain on 3 sides, thick enough in places that visibility dropped to almost nothing past 10 feet. Ellen coordinated 4 grid teams from the command post near the trailhead, radios crackling constantly with position updates as the afternoon wore on into evening. She'd run searches like this dozens of times before. She knew the rhythm of it, the particular tension that built as daylight thinned, and hope started quietly recalibrating itself into something harder and more practical. Around 6 in the evening, with full dark, maybe 40 minutes off, one of her volunteers radioed in that he thought he'd heard something from the ridge above the search grid, a voice calling out, faint but distinct enough to register over the wind. Ellen redirected part of her team toward the sound immediately. Standard protocol for any potential contact, though something about the radio report nagged at her even as she gave the order. The ridge in question sat well outside the plausible range for a 6-year-old on foot, steep enough that even adult hikers avoided it without proper gear, cut off from the lower trail system by a stretch of terrain that would have been difficult for anyone to cross, let alone a small child who'd been missing for hours already. She heard it herself once her team got closer, climbing hard against the grade with headlamps cutting narrow cones through the deepening dusk. A voice, thin, carrying strangely on the wind the way sound sometimes did along exposed ridgelines, calling out something that could have been help, could have been anything, distorted enough by distance and wind that it was hard to be certain. Then it called out a name. Not help, not a general cry for attention. It called Tyler's own name, clear enough this time that there was no mistaking it. The specific inflection of it, almost sing-song. The way a young child sometimes talked about himself in the third person without meaning anything strange by it. Ellen felt something cold settle in her chest at that. Lost children didn't typically call out their own names. It wasn't how fear worked in kids that age. They cried for parents, for help, for anyone, but rarely for themselves by name. And something about hearing it phrased that way, floating down off a ridge no 6-year-old should have been able to reach, made every instinct she'd built over 6 years of this work set up sharp and uneasy. She made the call to redirect her whole team uphill, against the original grid plan that had them working the lower terrain systematically. It wasn't standard protocol. Protocol said stick to the grid, trust the methodology, don't let a single unconfirmed sound pull resources off an established search pattern. But protocol also existed because most of the time, sound was the only lead you got. And Ellen had spent 6 years learning to trust her instincts about which sounds mattered. Her team moved fast up the incline, headlamps bouncing wild light through the trees, breath coming hard in the thin, cold air. The voice called out twice more as they climbed, each time from a slightly different angle, which Ellen told herself was just the wind again, the way ridgelines bent and scattered sound in directions that made a single source seem to move. She radioed the other teams to hold their positions, keep working the lower grid in case this turned out to be nothing. A false lead pulling resources away from where the child actually was. It was the responsible call. It also meant that if she was wrong, if this really was nothing, she'd have burned precious daylight and manpower chasing a sound up a ridge where no lost child could plausibly have gone. They reached the crest of the ridge a little before full dark. Headlamps sweeping across exposed rock and scattered pine, breath fogging thick air that had turned bitterly cold at this elevation. Ellen called out Tyler's name herself, voice carrying as far as she could push it, waiting for any response, any sound at all beyond the wind moving steady through the treetops. Nothing answered back. Not the voice that had called them up here, not anything resembling a frightened child, nothing but wind and the small, restless sounds of a mountain settling into full dark. Ellen stood there a long moment, chest still heaving from the climb, and felt the first cold thread of real fear work its way through the professional calm she'd carried into every search she'd ever run. Where had the voice gone? They found the handprints about 10 minutes later, small and shallow in a patch of exposed mud near a rock outcropping. The kind of soft ground that held detail, well even in fading light. Ellen crouched beside them, running her headlamp beam slow across the impressions. They were unmistakably a child's. Small fingers, palm width consistent with a boy around Tyler's age. But they faced the wrong direction entirely. Pressed into the mud pointing downhill, back toward the exact section of terrain her team had already swept twice that afternoon, not uphill toward where the voice had been calling from. Ellen stared at them a long moment, trying to make the geometry make sense. If Tyler had actually climbed this ridge, his prints should have faced uphill. Evidence of him scrambling higher, moving deeper into the terrain that had drawn her team up here in the first place. Instead, they showed him, or someone his size, she corrected herself, some part of her mind already refusing to fully commit to the assumption, moving away from this spot, back down into ground already covered. One of her volunteers, an older man named Roy Castellan, who'd been doing search and rescue in this district since before Ellen had taken over as lead, crouched down beside her and studied the prints without saying anything for a while. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, pitched only for her to hear. "That ridge calls back what it wants you to hear," he said. "Not what's really there." Ellen asked him what he meant by that, pressing him the way she might press any volunteer offering information relevant to an active search. Roy just shook his head slightly, eyes still on the handprints, and said he didn't have a better way to explain it, that he'd worked enough searches on this particular ridge over the years to trust the pattern without needing to understand it. She didn't have time to push further. The voice called out again, from a different direction now, downhill this time, back toward the lower search grid her other teams were still methodically working through. Ellen checked her watch without really registering the time, her mind racing through the geometry of it. If the voice really belonged to Tyler, it had somehow moved from calling out uphill to calling out from below in under a minute, a distance that would have taken even a fast adult runner several times that long to cover on this terrain. That was when the fog started rolling in. It came fast, the way it sometimes did at this elevation once the temperature dropped hard enough after sunset. A gray wall sweeping across the ridge and swallowing visibility down to almost nothing within a few minutes. Ellen's radio, which had been carrying steady static-laced chatter from the other teams all evening, dropped to true dead silence, no signal reaching her from any direction. Her team was effectively cut off now, isolated on a fog-bound ridge with a voice calling from somewhere below that had no business moving as fast as it apparently could. She made the call to hold position rather than risk moving her team blind through terrain none of them could see clearly anymore. They waited, huddled near the outcropping, headlamps cutting short useless cones through the thickening fog, listening to a voice that continued calling out at irregular intervals from somewhere below them, never quite matching a fixed point, never quite explainable by anything Ellen understood about how sound and terrain and children actually behaved together. The fog held for nearly 40 minutes before it finally began to thin, radio signal crackling back to life somewhere in the middle of that wait with news that made Ellen's knees go momentarily weak with relief. Tyler had been found. Not on the ridge, not anywhere near where the voice had been calling from, but nearly a mile in the opposite direction, curled up safe and shivering but unharmed beneath a fallen log close to the original campsite. In terrain the lower grid teams had already covered twice. Ellen sat with that information a long moment before the full weight of it settled in. Every call, every direction, every desperate redirection her team had followed up that ridge had led them further and further away from where the child actually was. The voice hadn't been guiding them toward Tyler at all. If anything, whatever had been calling out across that ridge had spent the better part of an hour pulling her most capable team steadily away from the one place they needed to be searching. That realization sat wrong in her stomach the whole walk back down, worse somehow than simple confusion would have been. It suggested intention. It suggested the voice hadn't been trying to lead anyone toward anything at all. It had been keeping her team occupied, distracted, focused on a ridge that led nowhere, for reasons that had nothing to do with helping find a lost child. Or, she told herself later, trying to talk herself back into something more comfortable, it suggested nothing of the sort. Sound did strange things in fog and elevation. Coincidence explained plenty. A tired search team, running on adrenaline and cold, could easily misjudge timing and distance in conditions like that. She almost believed it, walking back down through the thinning fog toward the command post where Tyler's parents were already wrapping him in blankets, his small face pale but calm in the glow of the portable lights. Almost. Back at the station 2 days later, filing her official incident report, Ellen found herself pulling the helmet cam footage from the volunteer who'd first reported the voice, more out of thoroughness than any specific suspicion. Standard procedure for unusual search incidents. Review the footage, note anything relevant, attach it to the file. She watched it alone in her office that evening, long after the rest of the station staff had gone home, the small screen glowing bright in the otherwise dark room. The footage was mostly what she expected. Headlamp beams bouncing through trees, the labored breathing of volunteers climbing hard against the grade, muffled radio chatter cutting in and out. She fast-forwarded through most of it, slowing down whenever the audio picked up anything resembling the voice they'd followed up the ridge. It was on the third pass through, watching more carefully now, that she noticed something in the background of one segment that made her stop the playback entirely and rewind it. There was a shape standing motionless in the trees, maybe 30 feet behind where her team had paused to catch their breath partway up the climb. Tall. Still, in a way that read wrong even in low-resolution footage, none of the small, unconscious movement a standing person naturally made, even when trying to hold still. It was there for the entire 11-second clip she kept rewinding, present in every frame, and yet every time one of her team members had turned to check behind them during the actual climb, which the footage showed happening twice during that stretch, the shape simply wasn't in frame when their headlamps swept that direction. Ellen sat very still in her office chair, watching the same 11 seconds loop over and over, trying to convince herself it was a trick of shadow and low light, a trick of compression artifacts on cheap camera equipment, a trick of her own tired eyes reading intention into something that was probably just a strangely shaped tree or an odd fold in the fog. The more she watched it, the less certain she became about anything, including whether the shape had moved slightly between loops or whether her mind was simply filling in motion that wasn't actually there. She closed the laptop before she'd finished the full review, telling herself she'd come back to it in the morning with fresh eyes. She never did. When she opened the file again 3 days later, meaning to attach the relevant segment to her official report, the footage had corrupted, static, scrambling exactly the 11 seconds she'd been reviewing, the rest of the recording playing back perfectly clean on either side of it. She tried 3 different programs to recover it. Nothing worked. The corruption sat in that footage like something had reached in and deliberately erased only the part that mattered. She never mentioned the shape in her official write-up. She wasn't sure how she would have phrased it in a way that didn't sound like exactly the kind of unreliable, overtired testimony that got search coordinators quietly reassigned to desk duty. What stayed with her longest, though, wasn't the footage. It was something Tyler said, almost offhand, when his mother gently asked him a few days later, once he'd calmed down enough to talk about it without getting upset, what had happened while he was lost out there alone in the dark. He'd said an adult voice told him to stay still and quiet, that someone was coming, and that if he stayed exactly where he was and didn't move or make noise, he'd be found safe. He credited that voice, in his small, matter-of-fact way, with keeping him safe through the night. He didn't seem frightened describing it. If anything, he seemed grateful, the way a child might describe a stranger who'd helped him find his shoe. Ellen never told the family what her team had heard up on that ridge. She never told them about the handprints facing the wrong direction, or the shape in the footage, or the unsettling arithmetic of a voice that seemed to have spent an hour deliberately pulling trained searchers away from exactly the spot where the child had actually been kept safe. She still runs search and rescue for the district. She still trusts procedure, still runs her grids methodically, still believes fundamentally in the value of trained calm over panic. But she thinks about that ridge sometimes on quiet nights, wondering what exactly had been behind her team that whole climb, patient and still and unseen, and whether it had been trying to lead them towards something, or simply keeping something between them and a frightened child until it was safe to let him be found. She's never gotten an answer she trusts. She stopped expecting one. The next account moves away from search grids and children entirely into something quieter and stranger, involving a trail register on an old mining road that seemed to be keeping records of its own. Colton Briggs had drawn the short straw that spring, at least as far as most rangers in the district saw it. Annual trail register audits weren't glamorous work, checking old logbooks against permit records, noting which registers needed replacing, cross-referencing names against the district's digital files to make sure everything matched up before the summer season brought a fresh wave of hikers through. It was the kind of task that mostly involved sitting in a truck with a stack of water-warped notebooks, flipping pages, and trying not to lose focus somewhere around the third hour. The old mining road register was one of the last on his list, tucked into a weathered wooden box bolted to a post near the trailhead of a section that had once served the coal operations decades before the land got folded into the park system. Not many people hiked this stretch anymore. It saw maybe a handful of visitors a month, mostly local history enthusiasts or the occasional hunter cutting through on their way to better ground, which was part of why the register had gone unaudited for nearly 2 years by the time Colton finally got around to it. He worked through the pages methodically, the way he did every register, checking names against dates, noting anything that needed follow-up. The box's hinge had rusted stiff, and he had to work it carefully to avoid tearing pages that had gone soft and brittle from years of humidity swings. Most of the entries were unremarkable. A few repeat names he recognized from other trail logs in the district. Nothing that raised any flags until he reached a section near the middle of the book, flipping back through what looked like several consecutive years of entries at once. One name recurred every single year, same date, always signed in the same handwriting. A distinctive, slightly slanted script that leaned hard to the left in a way that made it stand out from every other entry around it. Colton almost skimmed past it the first time, assuming it was just someone with a yearly tradition, the kind of thing hikers sometimes did to mark an anniversary or honor a memory. He'd seen that before in other registers. People came back to the same spot every year for reasons that made sense to them and nobody else. Then he actually read the name, Emmett Sorrell. Colton knew that name. Every ranger in the district who'd been around more than a few years knew it, the way small communities carried certain stories forward without ever writing them down officially. Emmett Sorrell had been a ranger himself, decades earlier, killed during an investigation into a partial mine collapse along this very road, back before Colton had even been born. It was the kind of story that got passed down informally during slow shifts, a cautionary tale about old mining infrastructure and the dangers of exploring sealed shafts without proper equipment. He sat there in the truck a long moment, staring at the signature, telling himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. A relative, maybe, sharing the same name. coming back every year to walk the road where their family member had died. That happened. People did things like that all the time, quiet, private rituals of grief that outsiders never fully understood. He flipped forward to check the most recent entries, curious whether the pattern continued into the current year. It did. The entry was already there, in the same slanted handwriting, dated 3 weeks in the future. Colton read the date twice, then a third time, checking it against his own watch to be absolutely certain he wasn't misreading something obvious. He wasn't. The date was clearly written, clearly future, clearly impossible for anyone to have logged in advance under any normal circumstance a trail register was ever used for. He closed the book carefully and sat in the truck a while longer than the task really required, the old wooden box creaking faintly in the wind outside his window, the rusted hinge he'd forced open earlier, now hanging slightly ajar, no matter how many times he pushed it back into place. He told himself it was probably some kind of joke. Local kids sometimes messed with trail registers, especially on stretches like this one where local legend already gave the place a certain reputation. Somebody had probably heard the Sorrel story from an older relative and thought it would be funny to write a fake future entry, never expecting anyone to actually notice or care. That explanation held together right up until he got back to the station and pulled the district's employment archive to check when exactly Emmett Sorrel had died, just to confirm the date lined up with what he remembered from the old stories. It did. Same date, every single year, going back exactly as far as the register's earliest surviving pages. The anniversary of his death. Colton sat with the old personnel file open on his screen a long while after that, the office around him gone quiet in the late afternoon light, the musty smell of old paper still clinging faintly to his hands from the register box. Whatever explanation he wanted to land on, coincidence didn't feel like it covered this anymore. The entry, 3 weeks out, was still sitting there in that book, dated and signed, waiting. Colton told himself he wasn't going to do anything stupid about it. That was the plan, at least, for the better part of 2 weeks. He filed his audit report the way procedure required, noted the register needed replacing due to age and wear, said nothing in the official paperwork about the recurring entry or the impossible future date. He figured someone was messing with him. Some local kid with a mean sense of humor and too much time on their hands. And the smart move was to simply ignore it and let the whole thing fade into the kind of story rangers told each other over coffee without ever really believing. He almost managed to convince himself of that. Almost. He mentioned it once, carefully, to Otis Reams, one of the older maintenance staff who'd worked the district for close to 40 years, and had a reputation for knowing more about the mining road's history than anyone still on payroll. Colton framed it casually, asking if Otis remembered anything strange about the old register out there, trying to keep his tone light enough that it wouldn't sound like he actually believed anything unusual had happened. Otis didn't laugh it off the way Colton half expected. He set down the tool he'd been working with and looked at Colton, steady for a moment before answering. "That road remembers who worked it," he said, voice flat and matter-of-fact in a way that made the statement land heavier than any dramatic warning could have. "Don't go proving it wrong." Colton pressed him a little, asked what exactly that meant, whether Otis had ever seen anything himself out there. The older man just shook his head and went back to his tool, the conversation apparently closed as far as he was concerned. That was often how these things went, Colton was learning. Nobody wanted to hand over a full explanation. They gave you a warning, shaped like a sentence, and let you decide what to do with it. What Colton decided to do, 3 weeks later, on the exact date written in that register, was drive back out to the old mining road after his shift ended, park a little ways off from the trailhead and wait. He told himself it was reasonable. If someone was pranking the district, staking it out was the responsible way to catch them. Better than letting the joke continue unchecked for another year. He brought a thermos of coffee, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and settled into the truck a little before sunset, watching the register box through the windshield as the light slowly drained out of the sky. His cell signal, weak on that stretch even during the day, dropped out completely once a full dark set in. His truck, when he tried to start it briefly around 8 to run the heater for a few minutes, coughed and struggled longer than usual before finally catching, a detail he filed away with mounting unease. No other traffic passed on the road all evening. Not one set of headlights the entire time he sat there, which wasn't unusual for this stretch but felt different somehow with the sky gone fully black and the temperature dropping steady outside. Around 11, he heard boots on gravel. Slow, deliberate steps, circling somewhere out past the edge of his headlight range, near the register box he'd been watching for hours. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam toward the sound, heart hammering, ready to catch whoever was out there in the act. The beam found nothing. Just the wooden post, the box, the dark tree line beyond it, empty and undisturbed. The footsteps continued anyway, circling, unhurried, somewhere just beyond what his light could reach no matter which direction he pointed it. He sat with the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip, running the beam back and forth, catching nothing. The sound never once matching up with where the light happened to be pointed. At some point past midnight, exhausted and cold, despite the truck's struggling heater, he saw the register box's pencil, the stub kept tied to the post on a length of string for visitors to sign with, appear to shift slightly in the dark. A small motion at the very edge of his flashlight's reach that he couldn't be certain he'd actually seen or simply imagined out of sheer nervous exhaustion. He didn't get out of the truck. Whatever resolve had carried him out here in the first place had thinned considerably by that point, replaced by a simpler, older instinct that told him staying inside the locked cab, engine running, doors secure, was the only sensible choice left available to him. He sat there through the rest of the night, doors locked, watching the register box through fogged windows, refusing to approach it, refusing to call out, refusing to do anything but wait for the sky to finally start lightening toward dawn. By the time the first gray edge of sunrise touched the tree line, Colton felt like he'd aged several years sitting in that driver's seat. He waited another 20 minutes after full light before finally working up the nerve to get out and check the register box, legs stiff and unsteady beneath him. The page was filled. Same slanted handwriting, same distinctive lean to the left, occupying the space where the future-dated entry had been sitting untouched for weeks. And beneath it, in the same handwriting, was a second line. His own name, Colton Briggs. No date attached to it at all, just his name, sitting there under Emmett's sorrels, waiting the way the other entry had waited, for a day that hadn't arrived yet. He tore the page out that morning, hands shaking as he folded it and stuffed it into his jacket pocket, telling himself he'd figure out what to do with it later, whether to report it, burn it, show it to someone who might actually believe him. He drove straight back to the station and requested a replacement register be installed on that stretch as soon as possible, citing water damage as the official reason. A new register box went up within the week. Fresh wood, blank pages, exactly as requested. When Colton drove past a few days later, unable to resist checking, the pages inside had already gone soft and yellowed at the edges, worn in a way that should have taken years to develop naturally, as though the road itself had simply refused to let the record start over clean. He still works for the district. He's requested, quietly and without much explanation, that his audit assignments avoid that particular stretch of road going forward. Nobody's questioned it too hard. In a county like this, some requests don't need much explaining. The next account climbs higher, up into a fire tower most rangers considered one of the easier postings in the district, until a young ranger covering a short-staffed rotation noticed the light activating on its own, every night, at exactly the same time. Denise Okafor had been looking forward to the fire tower rotation, if she was honest about it. Most rangers considered lookout duty something between a chore and a mild vacation. Quiet, solitary, mostly uneventful. The kind of assignment that gave you time to catch up on reading and think your own thoughts without a radio constantly demanding your attention. She'd volunteered to cover the short-staffed week without much hesitation, packing enough supplies for a week of solitude she genuinely expected to enjoy. The tower sat on a remote ridge, accessible only by a rough service road that took nearly an hour to climb even in good conditions, tall enough that on clear days you could see 3 counties spread out below in a patchwork of forest and distant farmland. The automated systems installed decades ago had mostly been decommissioned in favor of satellite monitoring, but the district kept the tower staffed during high-risk fire seasons anyway, human eyes still catching things technology sometimes missed. Her first 2 days passed exactly the way she'd expected. She logged visibility conditions every few hours, checked the old manual crank light kept as backup in case of equipment failure, and spent her evenings reading through the logbooks previous occupants had left behind over the years, a tradition at most fire towers. Informal journals documenting weather patterns, wildlife sightings, and the occasional bit of gossip about station politics from decades past. It was on the second night, sometime around 3 in the morning, that the tower's exterior light clicked on by itself. Denise woke to the sound of the old mechanical housing engaging, a distinct clunk and hum she recognized from the manual crank system she'd tested herself the day before. She sat up in her cot, confused, certain she hadn't triggered it, and climbed out to check the small control panel mounted near the tower's central window. The automated system showed no activity. According to every readout available to her, the light shouldn't have been capable of activating on its own at all. She'd been specifically briefed before this rotation that the tower's automated backup had been fully decommissioned years earlier, the wiring stripped for parts during a maintenance overhaul, leaving only the manual crank as a functional backup. She checked her watch, 3:17 exactly. The light stayed on for close to a minute before clicking off again, the housing settling back into silence with the same mechanical clunk it had made engaging. Denise stood at the window a long while afterward, studying the dark ridge outside, trying to figure out what could possibly explain equipment activating that had no power source to speak of. She told herself it was probably some kind of residual electrical charge, a quirk of old wiring finally discharging after years of dormancy, the kind of harmless malfunction that sometimes happened with equipment left unused for extended periods. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it was the only one that let her go back to sleep at all that night. The next morning, she logged the incident carefully in her own notes and radioed a brief mention down to the Valley station during her routine check-in, more out of thoroughness than actual concern. The station relayed back that no other tower or lookout post in the district had reported anything similar. As far as anyone else was concerned, her tower's light system had been fully inert for years. She spent the rest of that day doing what any careful ranger would do, examining the light housing itself for any obvious wiring issues, checking the crank mechanism, looking for loose connections or exposed wire that might explain a random electrical discharge. Everything looked exactly as decommissioned as she'd been told to expect. No power source, no functional wiring beyond the manual crank system, which required physical effort to operate, and certainly wasn't capable of triggering itself. That evening, watching the ridge from her small window as the light finally faded toward dusk, she noticed something she hadn't paid much attention to the night before. in her groggy, half-asleep confusion. The light, whatever had activated it, hadn't simply illuminated the tower's surroundings randomly. It had been angled, deliberately it seemed now that she thought back on it, toward a specific patch of forest on a distant slope, an area with no trail access marked on any map she'd reviewed before this rotation began. She pulled up the district's topographic survey that night, tracing the angle the light would have projected based on the housing's fixed position, cross-referencing it against the terrain visible from the tower. It lined up with unsettling precision, aimed almost exactly at a stretch of dense forest roughly 2 miles out, a section of the district she couldn't recall ever hearing mentioned in any briefing, incident report, or casual conversation among the other rangers. She checked the Valley Station log again the next morning, more out of curiosity now than obligation, asking whether anyone stationed there had happened to notice anything unusual on the ridge the previous night, any light or movement visible from lower elevation. The answer came back the same as before. Nobody else had seen anything at all. Whatever was happening at 3:17 each morning, it seemed to exist entirely within the tower itself, visible to no one but her, aimed at a patch of forest that, as far as any official record indicated, had no reason to matter to anyone. On the third night, unable to simply lie in her cot and wait for the light to activate on its own again, Denise climbed down the tower's interior ladder well before the appointed hour to check the wiring herself, flashlight in hand, determined to find some physical explanation she could point to and finally stop turning the mystery over in her mind every time she tried to sleep. The access panel sat low near the base of the tower, a metal door she had to work loose with a screwdriver from her repair kit, the hinges stiff from years of disuse. Inside, exactly as she'd been told during her briefing, the automated system's backup battery had been removed entirely, sitting instead in a small drawer nearby where a previous maintenance crew had apparently stored it years earlier rather than disposing of it properly. She lifted it out and examined it under her flashlight. Corroded terminals. No charge remaining that any multimeter would register. It hadn't powered anything in a very long time, according to every piece of physical evidence in front of her. She sat back on her heels in the cramped access space, staring at the dead battery in her hands, trying to reconcile what she was looking at with what she'd witnessed twice now with her own eyes. There was simply no mechanism left in this tower capable of producing what she'd seen. And yet, climbing back up before her shift resumed, she spent some time that afternoon working through the older logbooks she'd been reading for entertainment, searching now with more purpose than curiosity. It took a while, flipping through years of routine weather notes and mundane observations, before she found an entry that stopped her cold. The handwriting was old, faded, but still legible, dated decades earlier. "Light comes on for the ridge," it read, in a hand that pressed hard enough into the paper to leave faint indentations on the pages beneath it. "Don't go down there before sunrise." It was signed simply with 2 initials. R.H. Denise sat with that entry a long time, reading it over several times, trying to decide how seriously to take a warning scrawled by someone who might have written it decades before she was even born. She flipped forward through the surrounding pages, looking for any additional context, any explanation of who R.H. had been, or what exactly they'd witnessed to prompt writing something like that down. She found nothing else. The entry sat alone, unexplained. A single line dropped into an otherwise ordinary stretch of routine logbook notes. That night, the light activated again at exactly 3:17, same as before. But this time, watching from the window with her flashlight already in hand, she noticed something new. A pinprick of light answered from the ridge itself, small and faint. Blinking back from somewhere deep within the patch of forest, her tower's light had been aimed at both previous nights. It lasted only a few seconds before fading. Denise stood frozen at the window, watching the dark slope where the answering light had briefly appeared, her own tower's light clicking off overhead in its usual mechanical fashion. Her radio, which had been carrying faint but steady static from the valley station all evening, cut abruptly to true silence the moment the exchange occurred, resuming its normal crackle only after both lights had gone dark. She checked the tower's railing the next morning during her routine equipment inspection, running her hand along the old metal surface out of habit more than any specific intent. Near the base of one support beam, worn smooth by decades of weather but still visible if you knew to look for it, she found two initials carved into the metal. RH. She radioed down to the valley station that afternoon and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether anyone had records on a previous ranger with those initials who'd worked this particular tower. It took most of the day for someone to dig up an answer, relayed back to her just before dusk, with a note of genuine discomfort in the dispatcher's voice that Denise didn't miss, even through the radio's tinny speaker. A lookout matching those initials had died of exposure near that ridge decades earlier, found partway down the slope, in a season when nobody could later explain what had prompted him to leave his post and descend toward that patch of forest in the first place. No fire had been reported that night. No emergency had called him away from the tower. He'd simply gone down, alone, into terrain that offered no obvious reason for anyone to visit it, and hadn't survived the exposure that followed. Denise sat with that information a long while as the light faded outside her window, the tower creaking softly around her in the evening wind. She had 2 more nights left in her rotation. She found herself, for the first time since arriving, dreading the approach of 3:17, the way a person dreads a scheduled appointment they know they can't cancel, watching the clock creep toward that hour each night with a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fatigue. Her final night in the rotation arrived with a storm system threatening on the horizon, dark clouds building over the western ridgeline throughout the afternoon, though the forecast called for it to hold off until well after her relief arrived the following morning. Denise spent the evening packing her gear methodically, trying to keep her hands busy, trying not to watch the clock too obviously as it crept toward the hour she'd come to dread. Her scheduled relief call to the valley station, meant to confirm handoff logistics for the morning, went unanswered right around 3:17. She tried twice more, radio hissing back nothing but empty static both times, the timing lining up too precisely with everything else she'd witnessed that week to feel like coincidence. The light activated on schedule. Same mechanical clunk, same brief illumination angled out toward that same distant patch of forest. But this time, when the answering pinprick appeared on the ridge, it was closer. Not by a huge margin, nothing dramatic enough to point to with total certainty, but close enough that Denise, who had now watched this exchange twice before, felt the difference in her chest before she could fully articulate it in her mind. Whatever was answering back from that slope had moved nearer over the course of her rotation, night by night, patient and unhurried. She stood at the window a long moment, weighing what felt like an impossible decision. Climbing down to investigate directly, to finally walk toward that patch of forest and see for herself what exactly was answering back, felt like exactly the kind of choice that RH had apparently made decades earlier, the choice that had ended with him found dead of exposure on that same slope. Staying in the tower, doing nothing, felt equally impossible. Sitting up here every night for the rest of her career, wondering what she'd allowed to get closer without ever understanding why. She chose stillness. She reached for the manual crank mechanism, the one relic of functional equipment this tower still possessed, and for the first time in her rotation she cranked the exterior light off entirely, plunging the tower into total darkness well before the automated cycle would have ended it on its own. The mechanism resisted at first, stiff gears grinding against years of underuse, before finally giving way and cutting the light dead. She sat in the blackout that followed, radio silent in her lap, watching the small pinprick of answering light out on the distant ridge through the tower's window. It didn't advance any closer once her own light had gone dark. It simply stayed where it was, small and steady, for what felt like a very long time before it, too, finally faded and disappeared. Denise didn't move for what she estimated afterward to be close to 20 minutes, sitting motionless in the pitch dark, listening to the wind pick up outside as the incoming storm drew nearer, waiting for some sign that the exchange had truly ended and it was safe to move again. Eventually, hands still unsteady, she reached over and cranked the light back to its normal automated resting state, though she left it off for the remainder of the night rather than risk triggering anything further. Dawn arrived without further incident. Her relief ranger showed up right on schedule, cheerful and entirely unaware of anything unusual, mentioning nothing about missed radio calls or communication gaps the night before. When Denise checked the station log during handoff, there was no record of any malfunction reported from the Valley Station's end, no notation of the dead radio window, nothing to suggest her final night had been anything other than routine. Before she left, curious, despite everything telling her to simply move on, she went to check the disconnected backup battery one last time, still sitting in its drawer near the base access panel where she'd left it 2 nights earlier. She lifted it out, expecting the same cold, corroded weight she'd handled before. It was warm. Not dramatically so, not hot enough to burn, but distinctly warm in a way that no dead, corroded battery with no power source had any physical right to be. Warm the way something feels after being held, or used, or somehow, impossibly, active. She set it down carefully and didn't touch it again. She also went looking for the old logbook, meaning to show her relief ranger the entry signed RH, wanting someone else to see the words and confirm she hadn't imagined them during a week of accumulating exhaustion and nerves. The page was gone, not torn out roughly, not obviously removed, simply absent, the book's binding intact, the surrounding pages numbered consecutively without any gap to suggest a page had ever been there at all. Denise finished her rotation report that morning exactly the way procedure required, noting nothing unusual, citing only standard weather observations and routine equipment checks. She requested, quietly, that she not be assigned to that particular tower again, a request the district honored without asking many follow-up questions, the way these things often seemed to go once a ranger had clearly had enough of a particular posting without needing to explain exactly why. She still thinks sometimes about that patch of forest with no trail access, about a light with no power source that knew to reach exactly toward it every night at the same hour, and about a warm battery sitting silent in a drawer that had no reasonable way of holding any heat at all. The final account in this collection returns to where it all began, back to the same canyon system that swallowed Dale Coomer's missing hiker years earlier, following a veteran ranger through the last patrol of his entire career. Harold Pruitt had 31 years in with the Park Service by the time his retirement date finally arrived, more time than almost anyone else currently working the district. Enough that younger rangers sometimes came to him the way you'd consult an old family Bible, looking for answers about sections of the forest that didn't show up clearly in any official training manual. He'd planned his final week carefully, wanting to close out his career the same quiet, unremarkable way he'd spent most of it. No dramatic send-off, no fuss, just one last solo patrol on a trail he'd walked more times than he could count before he turned in his badge for good. He chose the creek trail for that final patrol, a stretch of forest that wound along a wide, shallow waterway, before crossing at a ford that had given hikers trouble for decades whenever storms pushed the water level up unexpectedly. It wasn't the most demanding section in the district, nothing that would tax an old man's knees too hard on his way out, but it held a kind of sentimental weight for him. He'd covered this trail more times over 3 decades than any other, watched it flood and recede, watched saplings he remembered as seedlings grow into full-size trees over the years he'd spent walking past them. He packed his truck that morning with the same familiar gear he'd carried on 1,000 patrols before this one. Water, radio, first aid kit, the paper map he still preferred over any digital system despite the younger staff's gentle teasing about it. He radioed dispatch with an easy, joking sign-off tone, telling them this was officially his last rodeo, and headed out under a clear autumn sky that felt almost too perfect for the occasion. The creek crossing had always been the trail's defining feature, a wide, rocky ford that ran loud and fast most of the year, loud enough that hikers sometimes had to raise their voices to be heard over it while planning their crossing. Harold had crossed it more times than he could remember, in every season, every water level, every kind of weather this mountain range could throw at him. As he approached it that morning, he noticed the silence before he consciously registered what was wrong about it. The creek wasn't running loud. It wasn't running quiet either exactly. It had gone essentially silent, the water moving past the rocks in a way that produced almost no sound at all. An absence so complete it made the surrounding forest feel unnaturally still by comparison. Harold stood at the trail's edge for a moment, studying the water, telling himself it was probably just a dry spell lowering the flow more than usual this late in the season. Low water didn't always mean quiet water, but it could, depending on how the current settled against the rocks. He'd seen stranger seasonal quirks in 31 years than a creek running a little muted. He kept walking, boots crunching against the dry gravel bed at the crossing's edge, the evening air cool enough now that his breath fogged faintly in front of him, despite the clear sky overhead. He was maybe halfway across the ford, testing his footing carefully on the exposed rocks, when he heard it. 2 short whistles, 1 long. Harold stopped dead in the middle of the crossing, one boot still hovering over the next rock, the sound settling into his chest with a weight that felt disproportionate to something as simple as a whistle carried on the wind. He knew that pattern. He'd known it for years, ever since a young ranger named Dale Coomer had come to him privately, off the record, years after his own transfer out of that district, describing a case that had never fully closed, a whistle he'd heard in a canyon that should have been empty, a pattern belonging to a missing hiker's private signal to his daughter. Harold had never fully believed the story at the time, or told himself he hadn't, filing it away the way you file away any strange campfire tale from a colleague you respect but can't quite corroborate. He'd never forgotten it either. Some stories just settled into a person and stayed there, waiting. He checked his radio out of pure habit, though he already suspected what he'd find. No other units logged in this section. No hunters with permits for this stretch this late in the season. As far as any official record was concerned, Harold Pruitt was the only person for miles in any direction. He kept walking anyway. That decision, more than anything else that happened over the following 2 days, was the one he'd turn over in his mind for years afterward, wondering whether 31 years of experience had made him wiser about these mountains or simply too stubborn to admit when something had already started closing in around him. He found the print about 20 feet past the crossing, pressed into the damp sand where the creek bank leveled out before the trail climbed back into the tree line. Bare. Facing the water, toes pointed back toward the ford he'd just crossed, as though whoever left it had been standing there watching him make his way across. Harold crouched beside it a long moment, studying the shape with the same careful attention he'd have given any piece of evidence early in his career, before something in his memory clicked into place with an unpleasant jolt. He'd seen a description like this before, years earlier, secondhand, from a seasonal ranger named Marcus Whitfield, who'd worked a gate road on the far side of the district and told a story about frost prints stopping mid-stride near a locked padlock. Different location, different season. The same essential shape, the same wrongness, the same sense of something standing exactly where a person had no reasonable way of standing. He stood back up slowly, knees protesting the movement more than they used to, and looked around at the quiet trail stretching out ahead of him. The light was already starting to shift toward evening, earlier than he'd planned for, though he couldn't quite account for how much time had actually passed since he'd left the trailhead that morning. An old memory surfaced then, something a retired colleague had told him decades earlier, back when Harold himself had still been the young ranger in the conversation rather than the old one. They'd been sitting together after a long shift, and the older man had said, almost as an aside, that this land kept its own case files, and it didn't close them out the way the district did. Harold had laughed it off at the time, chalked it up to the kind of superstitious talk old-timers sometimes indulged in after too many years in isolated postings. He wasn't laughing about it now, standing alone at a creek crossing with a bare footprint in the sand, and a whistle still echoing faintly in his memory. The crossing, which should have taken him no more than 5 minutes to ford properly, ended up eating close to an hour of his remaining daylight. He kept losing the trail markers along the far bank, painted blazes he'd followed for 31 years, suddenly seeming to appear in the wrong sequence, doubling back on themselves in ways that made no sense against the map folded in his jacket pocket. His radio, when he finally thought to check it again, had gone completely dead. Not even static, just an unresponsive weight in his hand that no amount of fiddling with the dial could revive. He exhaled hard at one point, more out of frustration than any conscious decision. A sharp burst of breath he didn't think twice about until the whistle answered it immediately afterward. Same pattern, same timing. Close enough now that Harold felt certain, standing frozen on the darkening trail, that he could have reached out and touched whatever direction it was coming from, though something in him refused to actually test that theory. He made camp that night without meaning to, settling into a rough bivouac just off the trail rather than risk navigating unfamiliar terrain after dark with a dead radio and markers that no longer matched his map. He sat with his back against a fallen log, flashlight in hand, listening to a forest that had gone almost entirely silent around him, the creek behind him still running with that unnatural, muted quiet it had carried since morning. It was sometime during that long, sleepless night, going through his mental case files out of nervous habit the way he sometimes did to keep his mind occupied, that the pattern finally assembled itself in full. The backpack Priya Rana had found on a closed trail years earlier. The retired call sign Wanda Suttle had answered on graveyard shift. The voice on the ridge that had pulled Ellen Voss's search team away from a lost child. The register entry bearing Colton Briggs's own name. The fire tower light Denise Okafor had watched answer back from a patch of forest with no trail access. Every single incident, when Harold laid them out properly in his mind against the district's actual geography, sat within a few miles of this same creek system, a connected web of waterways and ridgelines he'd walked the edges of for his entire career, without ever once stepping back far enough to see the whole shape of it. He'd never made that connection before. Nobody had, as far as he knew. Each case had been filed separately, handled by different rangers in different years, treated as isolated incidents rather than pieces of something larger and continuous, something that had apparently been running underneath the district's official records the entire time Harold had worked there. He didn't cross the creek again that night. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, He packed his gear methodically and turned back the way he'd come, choosing for the first time in his entire career to abandon a patrol rather than complete it. He didn't log an official reason on the incident report he filed that afternoon. He simply wrote patrol discontinued and left it at that, and nobody at the station pressed him for more, respecting, perhaps, the quiet authority of a man in his final week on the job. His retirement ceremony was small, the way he'd wanted it. Coffee and sheet cake in the break room, a few kind words from his supervisor, a framed certificate he'd hang in his garage and mostly forget about within a year. He spent his last afternoon at the station cleaning out his desk, the same desk he'd occupied for the better part of 2 decades, sorting through drawers full of old maps, spare batteries, and paperwork he'd long since stopped needing. It was near the bottom of the last drawer, tucked beneath a stack of outdated trail permits, that he found the printout. It was a radio transmission log, the kind the station's older system used to generate automatically whenever a call came through on any active frequency, before the district upgraded to fully digital dispatch a few years back. This particular printout was dated the same day he'd turned back at the creek crossing, time-stamped to the exact minute he'd made that decision, though he had no memory of anyone at the station ever mentioning a transmission logged during that window. The call sign field was blank, unlisted, in a system that had always required some kind of identifier for every logged transmission. Most of the message itself had printed as garbled static characters, unreadable noise filling the transcript where actual words should have been, except for one section near the middle of the line, where the characters resolved clear and legible before dissolving back into static on either side. His own name, spelled correctly, first and last, in a system that, as far as he knew, had never once, in his entire 31 years working for the district, logged a transmission using anything other than a badge number. Harold sat with the printout in his hands for a long while. The empty station quiet around him, most of the staff already gone for the day. He thought about showing it to someone, filing it properly, asking dispatch to explain how a transmission with no call sign had ended up naming him directly at the exact moment he'd decided to walk away from that creek. He thought about it seriously for a few minutes. Then he folded the printout once, twice, and fed it into the small shredder kept beside the filing cabinet, watching the paper reduce to thin, unreadable strips before he finished packing the last of his things into a cardboard box and carried it out to his truck. He moved out of the county within the year, relocating to a smaller town 2 states away where nobody knew his history with the Park Service, where creek crossings and whistle patterns and old mining roads carried no particular weight beyond ordinary scenery. He never hiked recreationally again, not once, not even on trails that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the district he'd spent his career protecting. He turned down nearly every interview request that came his way over the following years, reporters occasionally reaching out for retrospectives on long-serving rangers, oral history projects looking to document institutional memory before it disappeared entirely. He agreed to exactly one years later, a short piece for a regional publication doing a feature on retired Forest Service veterans. When the interviewer asked him, almost as an afterthought, whether he had any particularly memorable stories from his 3 decades on the job, Harold considered the question for a long moment before answering. The Creek Trail kept better records than we did, he said, and declined to elaborate further no matter how the interviewer tried to draw him out. The quote made it into the final piece exactly as he'd said it, printed without context, the kind of line readers probably assumed was some dry, folksy joke about paperwork and bureaucracy. Harold never corrected that impression. Back in the district, the Creek Trail was quietly reclassified as low priority sometime the following spring. Its patrol frequency reduced without much official explanation, beyond routine budget adjustments and staffing shortages. Rangers still walked it occasionally, when duty required, though few of them lingered there longer than necessary, and fewer still crossed the ford alone after a certain point in the afternoon. Years after Harold's retirement, a new seasonal ranger doing a routine trail register audit on that same stretch found an entry near the back of the current logbook that stopped her cold, the same way it had once stopped Colton Briggs on an entirely different section of the same connected forest. It was dated the exact week of Harold Pruitt's retirement, in handwriting that matched no employee record the district had on file, current or archived. There were no words in the entry at all. Just a simple mark, drawn rather than written, occupying the space where a signature should have gone. 2 short lines, one long one. The new ranger asked around the station about it, the way people always did when they first encountered something from this district that didn't quite add up. Nobody had a clean answer for her. A few of the older staff exchanged glances that suggested they knew more than they were willing to say out loud. The same careful, weighted silence Harold himself had once learned to recognize and respect over 3 decades of walking these same mountains. She filed the register away eventually, the way procedure required, and went back to work. The creek still runs quiet at that crossing most mornings, and the forest around it holds its silence the way it always has. Patient, unhurried, keeping whatever records it keeps in its own way, on its own schedule, waiting the way it apparently always has for whoever walks through next.